Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's wrap up week 69 with Silmarillion Saturday. As you know by now, these Saturdays are our chance to revisit the history and legends of the Elder Days, whether they're from the Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, or more. Now, while last week we watched in horror as Númenor sank beneath the waves, and as Ar-Pharazôn watched in horror as he and his men were stuck in the caves of the Forgotten, it turns out there's still a little bit more to the story. So today, we conclude the Akallabêth in the Silmarillion, where the faithful continue their struggle against Sauron. Elendil and his sons after founded kingdoms in Middle-earth, and though their lore and craft was but an echo of that which had been ere Sauron came to Númenor, yet very great it seemed to the wild men of the world, and much is said in other lore of Elendil in the age that came after, and of their strife with Sauron that not yet was ended. For Sauron himself was filled with great fear at the wrath of the Valar, and the doom that Eru laid upon sea and land. It was greater far than aught he had looked for, hoping only for the death of the Númenorians and the defeat of their proud king. And Sauron, sitting in his black seat in the midst of the temple, had laughed when he heard the trumpets of Ar-Pharazôn sounding for battle. And again he had laughed when he heard the thunder of the storm, and a third time, even as he laughed at his own thought, thinking what he would do now in the world, being rid of the Edain forever. He was taken in the midst of his mirth, and his seat and his temple fell into the abyss. But Sauron was not of mortal flesh, and though he was robbed now of that shape in which he had wrought so great an evil, so that he could never again appear fair to the eyes of men, yet his spirit arose out of the deep and passed as a shadow and a black wind over the sea, and came back to Middle-earth and to Mordor that was his home. There he took up again his great ring in Barad-dûr, and dwelt there, dark and silent, until he wrought himself a new guise, an image of malice and hatred made visible, and the eye of Sauron the Terrible few could endure. But these things come not into the tale of the drowning of Númenor, of which now all is told. And even the name of that land perished, and men spoke thereafter not of Elenna, nor of Andor, the gift that was taken away, nor of Númenor on the confines of the world. But the exiles on the shores of the sea, if they turned towards the west in the desire of their hearts, spoke of Marnu Falmar that was whelmed in the waves, Akallabêth the downfallen, Atalantë in the Eldarin tongue. Among the exiles, many believed that the summit of the Meneltarma, the pillar of heaven, was not drowned forever, but rose again above the waves, a lonely island lost in the great waters. For it had been a hallowed place, and even in the days of Sauron, none had defiled it. And some there were of the seed of Eärendil that afterwards sought for it, because it was said among lore-masters that the far-sighted men of old could see from the Meneltarma a glimmer of the deathless land. For even after the ruin, the hearts of the Dunedain were still set westwards, and though they knew indeed that the world was changed, they said, Avalone has vanished from the earth, and the land of Aman is taken away, and in the world of this present darkness they cannot be found. Yet once they were, and therefore they still are, in true being and in the whole shape of the world as at first it was devised. For the Dunedain held that even mortal men, if so blessed, might look upon other times than those of their body's life, and they longed ever to escape from the shadows of their exile and to see in some fashion the light that dies not, for the sorrow of the thought of death had pursued them over the deeps of the sea. Thus it was that great mariners among them would still search the empty seas, hoping to come upon the isle of Meneltarma, and there to see a vision of things that were. But they found it not. And those that sailed far came only to the new lands, and found them like to the old lands, and subject to death. And those that sailed furthest set but a girdle about the earth, and returned weary at last to the place of their beginning, and they said, all roads are now bent. Thus in after days, What by the voyages of ships, what by lore and starcraft, the kings of men knew that the world was indeed made round. And yet the Eldar were permitted still to depart, and to come to the ancient West and to Atalantë if they would. Therefore the lore masters of men said that a straight road must still be for those that were permitted to find it. And they taught that while the New World fell away, the old road and the path of the memory of the West still went on, as it were a mighty bridge invisible that passed through the air of breath and of flight, which were bent now as the world was bent, and traversed Ilmen, which flesh unaided cannot endure, until it came to Tol Eressëa, the lonely isle, and maybe even beyond to Valinor, where the Valar still dwell and watch the unfolding of the story of the world. And tales and rumors arose along the shores of the sea concerning mariners and men forlorn upon the water, who by some fate or grace or favor of the Valar had entered in upon the straight way, and seen the face of the world sink below them, and so had come to the lamplit quays of Avalanche, or verily to the last beaches on the margin of Aman, and there had looked upon the white mountain, dreadful and beautiful, before they died. What a poignant ending. Just the thought of somebody making it there across space, and then, of course, dying, but seeing that with their last sight. It's a powerful thought. Now, the part about Sauron surviving the downfall, it makes me think of the early part of Letter 211 that we looked at back in November before the end of Series 8. The writer had asked how Ar-Pharazôn could possibly have defeated Sauron when Sauron had the One Ring. Now, of course, much of Tolkien's answer to that is related more to the matter of Sauron's defeat several weeks back in the Akallabêth. But he does also address what happens to Sauron when Númenor falls. He writes, Sauron was first defeated by a miracle, a direct action of God the Creator, changing the fashion of the world when appealed to by Manwë. Though reduced to a spirit of hatred born on a dark wind, I do not think one need boggle at this spirit carrying off the One Ring, upon which his power of dominating minds now largely depended. I suppose that's the luxury of being the author of the story. You can simply declare that no one need boggle at the question of a spirit of hatred carrying off a physical ring. But, okay, if we don't need to boggle, we shan't boggle. Tolkien continues, touching on the end of the Second Age and explaining, Sauron was, of course, confounded by the disaster and diminished, having expended enormous energy in the corruption of Númenor. He needed time for his own bodily rehabilitation and for gaining control over his former subjects. He was attacked by Gil-galad and Elendil before his new domination was fully established. Fully established or not, it still cost Gil-galad and Elendil their lives, but it did bring Middle-earth a measure of peace for a couple of millennia. And folks, that does it for the Akallabêth and for this week's Silmarillion Saturday. Thank you for joining me, and please come back next week as I begin Of the Rings of Power in the Third Age. Yes, it's Third Age, but it's the Silmarillion, and this is Silmarillion Saturday. Please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can get an ad-free feed, bonus episodes, and become a part of my content council to help decide what I'll talk about next series. Now, this is Past Future Alan coming back to make a change to the episode. Those of you on video can undoubtedly tell that from the mismatched clothing. Now, you may have seen or heard the exciting news last week that soon, but not quite yet, the Prancing Pony podcast is going to be back on YouTube as I begin my new streaming show, The Prancing Pony Podcast Plays. Now, in the meantime, since I'm going to be combining all 4 of the PPP Productions content into one YouTube channel, I want to consolidate social media as well. So please be sure to follow @PrancingPonyPod on Twitter, or X if you want to call it that, Blue Sky, Instagram, and TikTok. On Facebook, we're still at the Prancing Pony Podcast. And finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.